What you are about to hear represents the single most consequential geopolitical announcement in the history of the modern Middle East, and Western strategists are only beginning to comprehend what just happened. In the span of 72 hours, developments occurred that fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region that controls 30% of the world's oil supply, and every capital from Washington to Tel Aviv is in emergency session, trying to formulate a response that does not yet exist. China just announced the establishment of a permanent naval facility in the Persian Gulf. Not a port visit arrangement, not a logistics agreement, a permanent military installation with berthing capacity for aircraft carriers, submarine support infrastructure, and integrated air defense systems. The location is Chabahar, Iran. The timeline for operational capability is 18 months, and the strategic implications represent nothing less than the terminal phase of American hegemony in the Middle East. I am going to take you inside every dimension of this development. How did China negotiate this agreement without triggering Western interdiction or meaningful diplomatic pressure? What does a permanent Chinese naval presence in the Persian Gulf mean for the petrodollar system that has underwritten American global power for 50 years? And what does the world look like when the United States no longer controls the sea lanes through which one-fifth of global oil supplies flow? There are no comfortable answers in this analysis, but the truth, however destabilizing, is the only thing worth examining. Four questions will structure everything that follows, and by the end of this presentation, you will understand why the strategic architecture of the Middle East just collapsed in a way that has no precedent in the post-Cold War era and no established playbook for American response. Let me be clear about what this announcement actually means in concrete terms, because the technical specifications matter enormously for understanding the strategic weight of this development. The Chabahar Naval Facility represents a $15 billion infrastructure investment spanning 270 acres of developed port territory. The agreement grants China a 99-year lease with full operational sovereignty over the designated military zones. Construction timelines indicate first phase operational capability within 18 months, with full infrastructure completion projected for 48 months. The facility specifications reveal the strategic intent: four deep-water berths capable of accommodating Type 003 aircraft carriers with electromagnetic catapult systems, submarine maintenance facilities designed for both conventional and nuclear-powered vessels, integrated air defense incorporating HQ-9B long-range surface-to-air missile batteries with engagement ranges exceeding 200 kilometers, hardened fuel storage with capacity for 1.2 million barrels, ammunition bunkers built to withstand precision-guided munitions, communication arrays providing encrypted satellite links to Chinese Southern Theater Command. This is not a symbolic presence. This is not a peacetime logistics arrangement that evaporates when tensions rise. This is permanent power projection infrastructure designed to survive American attempts at interdiction and continue operating through sustained conflict scenarios. The strategic geography makes the positioning even more significant. Chabahar sits 300 kilometers east of the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which 21 million barrels of oil transit daily. From this location, Chinese naval forces can influence traffic through the strait without technically operating within its waters, providing plausible deniability while maintaining operational effect. The facility provides China its first permanent military presence west of Malacca, extending the range of the People's Liberation Army Navy by 4,000 kilometers beyond any previous sustained deployment capability. Here is what you need to understand about the diplomatic sequencing that made this possible. This agreement was not negotiated in isolation. This represents the culmination of a 15-year strategic framework that Western analysts consistently dismissed as economically motivated rather than militarily significant. The foundation was the China-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed in March 2021, a $400 billion 25-year agreement that Western media covered primarily as an energy deal. The actual text, which few American analysts apparently read in detail, included explicit provisions for defense cooperation, joint military exercises, and infrastructure development in strategically significant locations. Chabahar was mentioned by name in annexes that received almost no Western media attention. China spent 3 years building the economic dependencies that made Iranian acceptance of permanent Chinese military presence not just acceptable but economically necessary. Chinese investment in Iranian oil infrastructure now exceeds $120 billion. Chinese firms control 43% of Iranian oil exports through long-term purchase agreements denominated in yuan. Chinese construction companies rebuilt critical Iranian ports after decades of sanctions-induced deterioration. Iran's economic survival is now structurally dependent on Chinese financial flows that can be restricted or expanded based on strategic cooperation levels. This is how great powers actually operate. The economic integration was never primarily about profit margins. It was about creating structural conditions where the target nation's elite interests align with your strategic objectives. Iran's political leadership now understands that their economic stability, their ability to maintain domestic spending programs, their capacity to fund regional proxy networks all depend on continued Chinese satisfaction with the relationship. The United States had 15 years to recognize this pattern and formulate a response. Instead, American strategy consisted of sanctions that pushed Iran deeper into Chinese economic orbit while providing no alternative framework. Washington operated on the assumption that economic pressure would eventually produce regime change or capitulation, never considering that it might produce permanent strategic realignment with America's primary great power competitor. Game theory explains this outcome with brutal clarity. Iran's choice set was either maintain resistance to American pressure while accepting permanent economic stagnation or accept Chinese partnership that provides economic development in exchange for strategic accommodation. The Iranian leadership, facing domestic unrest driven partly by economic conditions, rationally chose the option that offered material improvement while maintaining resistance to American demands. Now, let me explain why this development represents an extinction-level event for American strategic positioning in the Middle East and why the timeline of American decline in the region is measured in months, not years. American power in the Middle East rests on three structural pillars. First, the ability to guarantee freedom of navigation for oil exports, which provides leverage over both oil-producing and oil-consuming nations. Second, the implicit promise that alignment with America provides security guarantees that no regional power can challenge. Third, the petrodollar system, where oil transactions denominated in dollars create permanent demand for American currency and allow deficit spending without inflation consequences. The Chinese naval facility undermines all three pillars simultaneously. Consider the freedom of navigation guarantee. For 70 years, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, has maintained overwhelming naval superiority in the Persian Gulf. That superiority allowed Washington to credibly promise oil consumers that American naval power would keep supplies flowing regardless of regional conflicts. That promise justified security partnerships, weapons purchases, and political alignments that favored American interests. Chinese permanent presence in Chabahar means the Fifth Fleet no longer enjoys uncontested control. In any crisis scenario involving Iran, Chinese warships can now operate from hardened facilities with secure supply lines, air defense coverage, and strategic depth. American attempts to blockade Iranian oil exports now risk direct military confrontation with Chinese forces operating from permanent installations rather than expeditionary deployments that can be waiting out. The security guarantee pillar collapses even faster. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf monarchies have maintained alignment with Washington based on the calculation that American military power provides protection against regional threats, particularly Iran. But if American power can no longer guarantee control of the regional maritime domain, if Chinese presence creates military parity or even localized superiority, then the security value of American alignment diminishes while the economic benefits of Chinese partnership increase. This triggers a cascade of strategic defections that accelerates beyond American capacity to prevent. Saudi Arabia is already negotiating yuan-denominated oil sales to China. The Emirates are expanding defense cooperation with Chinese firms. Oman, which shares maritime boundaries with Iranian territorial waters, is finalizing infrastructure agreements that will make Chinese investment the dominant factor in national development planning. Each defection makes the next one more rational. Game theory calls this an information cascade where actors update their strategic calculations based on observing others' choices. When Saudi Arabia demonstrates that Chinese partnership is viable and American retaliation is manageable, smaller Gulf states rationally conclude that alignment flexibility is safer than rigid commitment to a declining hegemon. The petrodollar system faces the most catastrophic implications. Since 1974, Saudi Arabia's commitment to price oil exclusively in dollars created structural global demand for American currency. Oil importing nations needed dollar reserves to purchase energy, which meant they needed to export goods to America or attract American investment to earn those dollars. This system allowed the United States to run permanent trade deficits while maintaining currency stability because global oil demand created corresponding dollar demand. Chinese naval presence in the Persian Gulf combined with expanding yuan-denominated energy trade destroys the coercive mechanism that maintained petrodollar dominance. Previously, nations considering non-dollar oil transactions faced implicit threat that American naval power could interdict their energy supplies. Chinese permanent military infrastructure means that threat is no longer credible for nations operating under Chinese security umbrella. The mathematics of this transition are straightforward and devastating. Current global oil trade is approximately 100 million barrels per day. At $100 per barrel, that is $10 billion in daily transactions. If 30% shifts from dollar to yuan denomination over 36 months, that represents $1 trillion in reduced annual dollar demand. U.S. Treasury securities held as reserves for oil purchases become unnecessary. Dollar depreciation accelerates. American import costs increase. Inflation becomes structural rather than cyclical. But understanding the mechanics is only part of the analysis. We need to examine why this pattern keeps repeating throughout history, why empires consistently fail to recognize when regional control is slipping beyond retrieval, and why the United States is following a script written thousands of years ago. Let me take you through the historical pattern because what is happening now is not novel. It is the same dynamic that destroyed every previous empire that attempted to maintain permanent control over Persia and the trade routes it commands. Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BCE with the most advanced military force of the ancient world. Macedonian phalanx tactics were unstoppable in open battle. Greek siege technology could reduce any fortification. Alexander's logistical system allowed sustained campaigns across thousands of miles. He defeated every Persian army, occupied every major city, and declared himself king of Asia. His empire collapsed within 3 years of his death. The territories fragmented. The Persians reasserted control. Alexander's military supremacy produced no lasting strategic transformation. Why? Because military superiority is insufficient for permanent control of civilizational spaces with their own coherent identity, established trade networks, and geographic advantages that favor defense over occupation. Alexander could defeat Persian armies, but he could not garrison every city, control every trade route, or prevent the gradual reassertion of local power once his personal authority was removed. Rome fought Persia for 3 centuries in conflicts that consumed enormous resources and produced no decisive outcome. Roman legions could win individual battles. Roman engineering could build roads and fortifications across hostile territory. Roman gold could purchase local collaborators. But Rome never conquered Persia, never controlled the trade routes permanently, and ultimately fell while Persian civilization continued. The Mongols conquered Persia in the 13th century with military technology and tactical doctrine that made them unstoppable in open warfare. They killed millions. They destroyed cities. They established garrisons across the region. Within 2 generations, the Mongol rulers had become Persian in culture, language, and strategic orientation. The conquerors were absorbed by the conquered. The Soviet Union occupied northern Iran from 1941 to 1946, installing a puppet government and preparing for permanent annexation. American pressure forced withdrawal, but the deeper lesson is that even at the height of Soviet power, permanent control proved impossible to maintain against sustained local resistance supported by rival great powers willing to provide resources and diplomatic backing. The pattern is consistent across 2,300 years of recorded history. External powers can achieve temporary military superiority. They cannot achieve permanent strategic control over Persia without costs that exceed the value of the control itself. Eventually, resource exhaustion, domestic political pressure, or rival power intervention forces withdrawal. The regional civilization reasserts itself. The empire moves on to the next target or begins terminal decline. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003 with overwhelming military superiority, declaring mission accomplished after 3 weeks of conventional operations. 20 years later, American forces withdrew, having failed to create a stable pro-American government, leaving behind a nation closely aligned with Iran and increasingly integrated into Chinese economic networks. Afghanistan followed the same pattern. Military superiority proved insufficient for strategic transformation. Occupation costs exceeded benefits. Domestic political tolerance collapsed. Withdrawal became inevitable. Now Washington confronts the same pattern in compressed time frame. Chinese presence in Chabahar means that any American attempt to maintain control over Persian Gulf energy exports through military force will face sustained resistance supported by a peer great power with permanent infrastructure and unlimited resource commitment. The costs of maintaining American dominance now exceed the benefits, and regional powers recognize this calculation as clearly as American strategists refuse to. This is not ideological preference. This is pattern recognition based on 23 centuries of consistent outcomes. Empires that attempt permanent control over this region exhaust themselves and collapse while the region continues. America is not exempt from this pattern through technological superiority or ideological righteousness. The structural forces are identical. The outcome will be identical. Let me walk through the scenarios that emerge from this development because understanding the range of possible futures is essential for calibrating response strategies and personal preparation. Scenario 1, managed American withdrawal. In this pathway, Washington recognizes that permanent military dominance in the Persian Gulf is no longer achievable at acceptable cost and begins strategic repositioning. The Fifth Fleet maintains presence in Bahrain but operates with reduced capability and narrower mission scope. American security guarantees to Gulf states are renegotiated downward to exclude scenarios involving Chinese-backed Iranian action. Energy policy shifts toward Western Hemisphere supply chain development and reduced dependence on Middle Eastern imports. This scenario requires strategic discipline and domestic political tolerance for perceived defeat that American political culture rarely demonstrates. The probability is approximately 15%, concentrated in futures where economic crisis forces rapid military spending reduction or where catastrophic military engagement elsewhere demands resource reallocation. Scenario 2, escalatory confrontation. Washington interprets the Chinese facility as unacceptable challenge requiring forceful response. Options might include naval harassment of Chinese vessels approaching Chabahar, cyber attacks against facility infrastructure, support for Iranian opposition groups to destabilize the host government, or expanded weapons deliveries to regional actors willing to conduct proxy operations. This pathway leads to sustained low-intensity conflict that slowly escalates toward direct military confrontation. Chinese tolerance for interference with their permanent installations is near zero, creating tripwires that make accidental war increasingly probable. This scenario probability is approximately 40%, highest in futures where American domestic politics reward confrontational posturing and punish accommodation. Scenario 3, accelerated regional realignment. Gulf states interpret Chinese permanent presence as evidence that American dominance is ending and rapidly expand their own partnerships with Beijing. Saudi Arabia formalizes yuan oil sales, signs defense cooperation agreements with Chinese firms, and allows Chinese military logistics access to Saudi ports. The UAE follows similar trajectory. Within 36 months, the Persian Gulf functions as a Chinese sphere of influence with American presence reduced to token, symbolic installations. This scenario requires no American consent and faces minimal American capacity for prevention. Regional actors make sovereign choices based on their assessment of shifting power dynamics. The probability is approximately 65%, representing the most likely pathway based on current trajectory and historical pattern. Scenario 4, economic cascade and dollar crisis. The combination of reduced petrodollar demand, accelerating de-dollarization in other regions observing Gulf developments, and loss of confidence in American security guarantees triggers rapid dollar depreciation. Treasury yields spike as foreign reserve holders reduce positions. Import costs increase sharply. Inflation becomes structural. Federal deficit financing becomes prohibitively expensive. American economic model based on consumption funded by foreign capital inflows breaks down. This scenario can occur independently or in combination with scenarios 2 and 3. The probability is approximately 50% within the 36-month time frame, increasing to 75% within 60 months if regional realignment continues. The scenario I consider most likely is a combination of pathways 3 and 4, where regional realignment accelerates dollar stress, which further reduces American capacity for effective response, creating a reinforcing cycle that produces rapid transformation rather than gradual adjustment. The timeline is critical to understand. Some analysts suggest these transitions occur over decades, allowing gradual adaptation. The historical evidence indicates otherwise. When empires lose control of critical choke points and resource flows, the collapse accelerates because it creates information cascades where multiple actors simultaneously recognize the power transition and adjust their strategies accordingly. The British Empire's loss of Middle Eastern control occurred in the span of 18 months from 1947 to 1948, not because British military capabilities evaporated overnight, but because regional actors simultaneously recognized that British willingness and capacity to maintain dominance through force had crossed a threshold. American withdrawal from Afghanistan collapsed in weeks once the inevitability became clear, despite 2 decades of prior commitment. I assess 30 to 48 months as the time frame for fundamental transformation of American positioning in the Middle East, measured from Chinese facility operational capability. This is not prophecy. This is pattern recognition based on how information cascades operate in multipolar systems where regional actors update strategies based on observed commitment levels from competing great powers. Now, before we close, I want to address the analytical framework we have applied here because understanding the methodology matters as much as the conclusions. This analysis employs predictive history using game theory, structural incentive analysis, and historical pattern recognition. The approach assumes that actors respond rationally to incentive structures, that structural forces constrain available choices regardless of ideological preference, and that historical patterns repeat because the underlying dynamics remain constant across civilizational timescales. I might be wrong. The scenarios outlined might not materialize in the time frame assessed or in the manner described. If that occurs, we will return to this analysis and examine which variables were miscalculated, which assumptions proved incorrect, or which unexpected developments altered the trajectory. But I want you to understand that this framework is not speculation. It is systematic analysis of incentive structures, capability assessments, and historical precedent. When I predict that American dominance in the Middle East ends within 36 months, I am not hoping for that outcome or advocating for it. I am analyzing the structural forces and concluding that this outcome is the most probable based on how similar situations have resolved throughout history. The most important skill you can develop is the ability to analyze these situations independently. Do not accept my conclusions without examining the evidence. Test this framework against what you observe in the news over coming months. Watch whether Saudi Arabia expands Chinese partnerships. Monitor whether dollar demand shows stress indicators. Observe whether American responses to Chinese presence prove effective or symbolic. The framework I have provided gives you tools for understanding these developments as they unfold. You now understand why Chinese permanent naval presence in the Persian Gulf represents more than a single facility opening. You understand the three pillars of American regional power and why all three are now compromised. You understand the historical pattern of empires attempting to control this region and why that pattern suggests inevitable American withdrawal. You understand the scenario pathways and their relative probabilities based on incentive structures and historical precedent. As these developments continue to unfold over the coming months, we will analyze each new phase through this same framework. When the facility reaches operational capability, when the first Chinese carrier group deploys to Chabahar, when Gulf states formalize energy agreements denominated in yuan, when American strategists attempt responses that this analysis suggests will prove insufficient, we will examine each development and refine our understanding of the timeline and mechanisms through which this transition occurs. History does not forgive nations that ignore structural realities in favor of comforting narratives. The question is not whether American dominance in the Middle East ends, but whether the transition occurs through managed withdrawal or catastrophic confrontation. The next 36 months will provide the answer, and that answer will determine the trajectory of global power for the remainder of this century.